Hello, my name is Carissa Malice, and I've chosen to do a research paper on U.S. China relations for my final project. So, my research question is: how have economic interests and human rights issues played a role in U.S. China relations since 1958, and what impact will they have on the future of this relationship? Also, how has China's rise as a hegemonic power affected the relationship, and what does it mean for the future? This question is extremely important because the US and China are the world's largest two economies. Given the current status of their tumultuous rivalry, it is absolutely essential to analyze and understand the history of the relationship along with the current events of today in order for US policymakers to implement reforms that are both appropriate and relevant in order to improve the current status of the relationship and to cultivate a future of a continued partnership. So to analyze this research question, I wanted to take a historical approach. And so I have a timeline here of important dates that factor into the relationship. Starting with 1958 to 1961, Chairman Mao Zedong of the People's Republic of China implemented the economic reform, the Great Leap Forward, where deprivatization of land, extermination of pests, and introduction of backyard furnaces occurred. However, this led to one of the most devastating famines and resulted in about 30 million people dying. And then we have 1964, though, the People's Republic of China emerges as a nuclear power after testing its first atomic bomb, and it's establishing itself as a rising power within the world. In 1972, the door to Sino-American rapprochement opens due to both powers' interest in improving relations. 1976 is very significant because Chairman Mao Zedong dies, and this allows for economic reforms to start taking place and introduces China to the world economy as it opens its market to the world. Then we have 1979, where the U.S. decides to take China's side on the Taiwan issue and establishes the Taiwan Relations Act, where it says that it will continue to have relations with China, but it will not be diplomatic ones. It can be commercial and cultural, but they will not take any part in agreeing that Taiwan is separate from China. Then in 1980, we have the one-child policy, where the families in China are no longer allowed to have more than one child. If they do, they're subject to facing reprimands such as public ridicule, fines, imprisonment, forced abortions, forced sterilizations, and cases of infanticide. This policy remained in effect until 2015. Then we have the 1984, where U.S. and China improve their economic ties, and U.S. wants to receive purchases from Beijing on their military equipment, thus improving their economic relations. Then we have 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre, where the People's Liberation Army of China moved against the pro-democracy supporters, and it resulted in thousands being arrested and killed. The actual numbers remain unknown due to Chinese censorship. U.S. public opinion and policymakers denounce China for its violence and implement economic sanctions against China. Though we then have it starts in 1993, where Bill Clinton said that the renewal of China's most favored nation trading status was dependent on complying with improving its country's human rights. However, China's most favored nation status was renewed in 1994 without having to comply with any of the human rights changes. Then we have 2000, where the U.S. China Relations Act is passed, which then grants China permanent normal trading relations with the U.S., and then this then paves the way for China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001. In 2008, China becomes the U.S.'s largest foreign creditor. The U.S. is in debt to China, and China has continued to establish itself as a world economy. And As it does so, 2010, China then becomes the world's second largest economy. We then have 2013 with the emergence of Xi Jinping, who becomes the leader of the People's Republic of China. He is the president and is now president for life as he has passed. 2015, we have the U.S. warning China over its actions in the South China Sea, where it is terrorizing vessels and creating artificial land to expand its territorial claims, which then jeopardizes the free trade of the sea. Tensions over this issue continue to today. We have 2018, where the U.S. trade war with China begins, as each country imposes sanctions on the other, and the other then retaliates instead of submitting to the other. 2019, protests in Hong Kong erupt against the National Security Act that they want to pass that would allow China to extradite prisoners. This unleashes a series of pro-Beijing police brutality and human rights violations against the pro-democracy people of Hong Kong, which still continues to this day. 2019, we also have the COVID-19 virus outbreaks that began in Wuhan, China, and eventually spreads throughout the world, which completely disrupts the world economy. This then leads to the U.S. and China increased tensions where each one is blaming the other for mishandlings of the pandemic. We then are brought to 2020, where the Phase 1 trade deal is signed, which then takes a step towards easing the trade war, where tariffs are eased and an increase of goods are promised to be purchased between the two. After going through those events and researching more thoroughly about them, I've come to the conclusion of 3 observations in regards to U.S. China relations. 1, the relationship between the two powers tends to take on a cyclical pattern where China will commit a series of human rights violations, and then the U.S. would reprimand them publicly and typically accompanied with sanctions. However, eventually the reprimands would weaken and policymakers' focus then shifts towards their economic interests with China. The cycle then continues to repeat itself when China inevitably continues to commit human rights violations. Number 2, China's rising hegemonic power is a direct threat to U.S.'s current dominance as the world's leading power. As China emerged as a leading world economy, it meets the U.S. imposed sanctions with retaliation instead of submission, which calls the U.S.'s power and control over world trade into question. This allows China to not have to give in to U.S. demands, especially when it comes to addressing its human rights violence. And then finally, number 3, we have the COVID-19 pandemic that has shaken up the world economy and has negatively affected both economies. Both countries have taken to finger-pointing the other for each one's mishandlings of the pandemic, and China has asserted itself as a leader in handling the pandemic by locking down its cities and donating personal protective equipment to countries in need throughout the world that are suffering from the pandemic. Although we are not entirely sure of China's actual COVID numbers, and a lot of the quality of the personal protective equipment that they shipped is unsatisfactory. They are still leading the way by making those public gestures and asserting some form of leadership throughout the world. Whereas the U.S. has been fumbling with its handlings, infection rates continue to soar in the U.S., and it continues to experience supply shortages. Although the COVID-19 pandemic is not yet over, it is inevitable that the future of U.S.-China relations will be determined based on whether or not the two can stop the blame game and instead focus on fostering a cooperative relationship with one another. So we will have to see how that goes. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.